Hello, welcome back to Madrona's Pulse Teachings. I am Iris, and it is time to chat about Uranus back in Taurus. We have quite the atmospheric day with the elements here. It is raining in Nova Scotia. The ocean is pounding onto the shore, and it's pretty lovely, witchy atmospheric day here. So that's pretty lovely for the 29th degree of Taurus, which is where Uranus is sitting. So we are talking about the archetype of awakening and radical change, calling us to authenticity, also in our individual evolution and always also the collective evolution. Moving back into the Earth yin sign of Taurus. This move happened either November 7th or November 8th, depending where you are. And it will last all in all until April 25th. On April 25th, 2026, Uranus will move back into Gemini, and it will not come back into Taurus for over 80 years. And on February 3rd, that is when Uranus will station direct at 27 degrees of Taurus. So we are working from now until February of Uranus moving back through these last 3 degrees of Taurus, showing us that there is awakening to happen in our, firstly, embodied way of being, in our values, in our grounding into what is an intrinsic sense of belonging, and that this needs to happen in order for us to move forward into the radical awakening communities, ways of thinking, ways of communicating, perceiving, information making, community building that Uranus moving into Gemini represents. And we've had a taste of this. That said, we didn't just have a taste of Uranus in Gemini. We've had a taste of Uranus in Gemini conjunct Sedna, which really brings in some pretty beautiful witchy reclaiming layers into what Uranus is potentially awakening in our own communication, in our own perception, ways of interpreting, and especially as we bring that into the communities that we're part of. Now, we will talk more about that in 2026 as we're approaching April. But now all of us are working with Uranus back wherever you have the final 3 degrees of Taurus. If you have any placements in the final degrees of Taurus and or final degrees of Scorpio, final degrees of Aquarius or Leo, this Uranus is speaking directly with you. Okay, we're really looking at like 26 to 29 degrees of those signs, the fixed signs. And especially regardless of if you have placements or not, Uranus being back in these final degrees of Taurus. So we started working with Uranus and Taurus in 2018. So firstly, you can reflect back to 2018, what was going on for you then, and what has shifted in your values, in how you embody your values. Taurus at its core is about our innate belonging. It is about, and I'm going to talk about that, it is about your values, how you embody them in your life, the journey of embodying our values, which is not an easy journey. The way that then goes into things like how we want to even understand money, let alone make money, spend money. What does it even mean to invest? Whether that's investing our energy, our time, our emotions, our money, how it's all connected to our values. Okay, so right there, Uranus going back into Taurus is also a final radical awakening into how we even understand what money is, how we work with it in our own lives and collectively. Right, this happening as there is a lot of, in the mainstream, collective narratives kind of calling attention to the unethical hoarding of wealth that happens in various ways in our culture. And on the personal level, however, this is these final months especially now through February, because that's the Uranus retrograde. And Uranus retrograde is saying there's stones we have that need to be turned over. And there's roots underneath those stones into the earth, into the soils of your psyche. And if you go and you follow those roots, you will find connection and belonging to your values that no one person or way of life or even ideology can define for you, let alone tell you aren't worthy. Taurus is about our own courage and strength to embrace our values for our life. Taurus is very much about you and your beliefs. It is not about your family's beliefs. It is not about your partner's beliefs, your friend's beliefs. It is about you and your connection, primal attachment in this body to the earth. Okay? To, primal attachment, mother's womb. Then we come out, and it is the ecosystem that is holding us as this embodied being. And Taurus is the earth sign. That is how when we spend time, whether it's in the woods or on the shore or by the lake or in the desert, whatever ecosystem, in the fields, whatever ecosystems are part of your natural environment, community, habitat, the land that you live on, that there are ways of knowing and understanding that simply spending time and being with your kin in that way of relating is going to teach you about yourself the way that no book can, no teacher can, the way that the trees are our teachers, the earth, the soil, the water. I'm guessing you can't hear it, but maybe you can. That ocean, that's waves crashing onto shore, right? Whatever ecosystem we're part of, Uranus coming into Taurus is this one final reminder to embrace your innate belonging. And the reason that is so important, not even going into the environmental implications of it, which are great and expansive and enough to radically alter how we go about being humans and in society, what we consider is important in terms of the economy and profit. When our values come from our rootedness into the earth and we care about the earth and the land as we care about our family, we treat it very differently. And it is not something to be exploited. It is not something to be cut up. It is something to be honored. And so when we, even beneath that, however, I said I wasn't going to go into the environmental implications, and I did. And because I'm passionate about it. But when we come into, for our own journeys of healing, Taurus belonging is this beautifully witchy healing connection to earth that just can't be taken from us. That is underneath all of, so many different relational ways of being. Now, that said, we also can absolutely carry the lineages of land and wounding from colonization, imperialism, and those are wounds that also heal in this life. And also how whatever land we're living on now becomes teachers, because we are connected to the land that we live on now, wherever you are. And whether you are rural or urban, when you are out there walking, whether it's on dirt or layers of concrete, that underneath, you're connecting to that soil. You can also just hop off and walk on the grass, right? There's always this experience of belonging. And I can speak personally as someone who was born into a family that both intergenerationally and in this, my embodied life, we're talking about types of trauma and violence that our society does not talk about, and when it does represent, it does a shitboard job of it, right? The representation of violence in the family in mainstream media is unfortunately so failing survivors, and also the education that media always is. And when our early experience, hasn't been nurturing a belonging, and even when we have that nurturing a belonging, there's usually some complicated layers. And whereas something like attachment theory is going to come in with a really particular way of healing that, and while there's some helpful tools and views in there, it's not bringing any awareness to the reality of the type of belonging that Taurus teaches us about, which is our embodied belonging, in the way that our embodied belonging, having a consciousness of the body, connects us to Earth. And that's why I say this last radical awakening of Taurus is also healing that witch wound of that innate earth-based spirituality that many of us, regardless of gender, carry with us in different ways, and there's different lineages of wounding there. And the way that, especially in the West and through the witch trials, Christianity really did, from a forced power over ideology, create this violence to those who 80% of were women, and did represent a threat to that power over ideology. That force of violence that also parallels other forces of violence, thinking of residential schools, there's so many ways that power over ideology has attached itself to an understanding of spirituality, such that we carry within us, even today, even those who don't think about or feel into their witchy ways, there's so much healing and reclaiming and recovering and remembering. The crows are going wild right now. I really hope you can hear them. In our Taurus, in our embodied Taurus ways. And where you have Taurus in your natal chart is going to speak to this. And so we're coming back in now through February. This is a way of being and belonging that is underneath everything that we're taught about, for the most part, especially if it's in a mainstream educational or route into being a human. It's everything that, for the most part, is underneath pop astrology's presentation of the Taurus. We're talking about the archetypal reckoning of Taurus right now, because that's what Uranus brings up. Uranus is also a reckoning energy, especially when it's in the collective. And that's why the sudden change, and this is also where we do need to be careful about how we interpret some of the events, whether we're trying to understand astrology from kind of putting narratives together of the past or now, because if the archetypes are attempting to awaken, they do not care if it is good or bad. They do not care. They don't use our categories. They are not human-centric. And Taurus talks about how our human-centric view is very problematic for the sustainability of humans' emotions and the earth, because we are not supposed to be disconnected from our inherent belonging. And Uranus is one final reckoning for that belonging and connection. And so sometimes what says, oh, that's just bad, that was bad that happened, whether we're talking about something in the stock market or we're talking about, these kind of simple interpretations. There's sometimes a lot of other layers going on. And if we are willing to be honest about what humans are doing collectively, we can also see how, okay, here's an opportunity for change. Here's an opportunity for starting over. And if that's not going to happen in the structures of power, it can absolutely happen in how we embody our own lives, which brings us full circle back to our Taurus values. And the Taurus value journey is not usually easy. This also aligns with second house journeys in your chart, because a lot of us are taught that upholding certain values also has to do with love. And that's where we go to those first socializations. It's where we go to family, where, going back to that witch wound, if I show my spirituality, that is like juicy and earthy and witchy and oh yeah, am I going to be shamed for that? Am I going to be othered for that? And so the first thing with reclaiming our Taurus values is that we have the space to just be with ourselves, honoring, allowing any grief for having hidden parts of ourselves, for what we dream of, for what connects us to earth, for what connects us to self-love in our body. That is also part of Taurus. Words for Taurus that don't usually get mentioned with Taurus are love and safety and belonging. But it's a love, it's a different than a Cancer love. It's a love that comes from allowing myself to live in my body, even when my body doesn't function in the ways that I might long for it to. Or when my body scares and when my body bears the scars that are also part of the stories that have been scary, right? And yet when we disconnect our own embodiment from the stories that others have caused for us, when we disconnect it from the social stigma that attaches itself to all the different ways we can be embodied, that's when we're claiming empowerment through our own journey. And then that roots us in, and that makes our spine go a little bit straighter. And that makes my eyes get a little bit brighter. And that makes me not give an F about how someone else is judging me. Because they have no idea what it is like to be in my embodied way. Let alone if you are a survivor of physical or sexual violence, right? Intergenerational trauma, right? Like, it's your body. You get to embody it any freaking way you want, right? And so Taurus radically awakens that. Taurus has such, Uranus and Taurus, there's like this fierceness, but it comes about in a yin way. And it is so strong, but it's a different type of strength than like the stereotypical Mars, Aries, which is a whole other video about how that goes into toxic masculinity stereotypes in astrology. But like Taurus is yin, and it's fierce and it's strong and it's supple and it is precious and it is luxurious in the lingering of the smell of the rain, and all of like the senses are the route back to connection and belonging through Taurus. And so if you do struggle with words like self-worth, and you do struggle with those, let all of that go. And for the next few months, focus on a relationship with your senses as a route back into presence, a route back into connection. It requires slowing down. It requires slowing down and lingering with the smell of a patch of grass, whether I'm in the city or I'm in a rural place. Yin slows us down. It reconnects us to a different timeline. And in Taurus, it's the presence of the earth wisdom that we access innately through our body. And all of this wants to awaken. And that's even where yes, we can talk about Taurus and money and income. But if we just start out talking about Taurus and income or money, we're skipping the primary anchor into Taurus, which is our embodied belonging and the values that come from that. And that's the problem, right? In a society that wants instantaneous, and social media is restructuring the consciousness even more into that desire and belief that life should be instantaneous. It wants the quick fix. And then we see how astrology does that. Here's the 2 points and this and that and this. And now astrology is a lifelong, like, slow burn. There's moments of it when it's like rapid and our relationship can change with it. But astrology is nothing but a mirror reflecting our psyche's embodied path on this plane. And the relationship with it develops. And so if we skip the core archetypal meaning, which is that Taurus embodiment, belonging, sustainability on the emotional, psychological, spiritual, environmental, physical plane, and we just go into how do I make a lot of money, we've kind of missed the point. And we're actually just applying what is a colonial, capitalist, patriarchal, imperialist view into astrology. And my interest in astrology as an embodied and evolutionary practitioner, that's also survivor-centered, is how can I linger in it? How can it restructure, which for me aligns entirely with a healing of that witch wound that I mentioned, because that is our embodied spirituality. That is our connection to Earth. And everyone can come into that differently. I can come into that as someone who's practiced Wicca, or I can come into that as a Christian. I can come into that as a Buddhist. All it is really reclaiming what's just here to be embodied and remembered, because it's already in us, in our psyche. And Taurus is how we root into that. And Uranus and Taurus is such a beautiful opportunity for us to really come home to our values, to come home to our senses, to come home to the body. And just focusing on that, that's going to change our values. That's going to cultivate self-worth and self-love. That's going to change our relationship to money, our relationship to time. It's going to change everything because it goes to the root. It's going to change our relationships in our family. It's going to change our relationships to our wounds. It's going to change everything. And there's a lot of love to be found there. So there we have it. There is our first Uranus back in Taurus message. And that's it, folks. I am sending this elemental Nova Scotia on the wilds of the edge energy out to you. And I will see you soon. Bye.